The cold seeped into Alara's bones, a relentless ache that had long surpassed the sting of winter and now gnawed at her very marrow. Her breath plumed in the frigid air of the small cabin, a wisp of vapor against the dim light filtering through the single, frost-rimmed window. Outside, the mountains loomed, cruel sentinels draped in an unforgiving shroud of white. Inside, the silence was a heavier blanket than any she owned, muffling the faint scratch of a mouse in the wall, amplifying the frantic beat of her own weakening heart. Days had bled into weeks since the fever took Liam, then little Maeve. The isolation, once a chosen solitude with her small family, had become a shroud woven of grief and dread. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, each task a monumental effort. The last embers in the hearth barely glowed, struggling against the onslaught of the penetrating cold, mirroring the last flicker of her own hope. A faint scratching sound at the door, hesitant and small, pierced the oppressive quiet. Alara froze, her hand clutched to her chest. Couldn't be. No one came this deep into the foothills in such weather, certainly not without intent, and she had nothing left to take. The scratching came again, more insistent, accompanied by a faint, breathy whimper. Fear warred with a dull, morbid curiosity. She shuffled towards the door, her old shawl pulled tighter around her shoulders, the planks groaning beneath her weight. Her fingers fumbled with the wooden latch, numb and clumsy. As the heavy timber swung inward, a blast of icy wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow. Standing on the small, snow-dusted porch was not the bear or wolf she had half expected, nor the grim specter of a debt collector. It was a child impossibly small, wrapped in layers of threadbare wool, face streaked with dirt and tears, eyes wide with a desperate plea. The child's lips were blue, chapped, trembling. Before Alara could utter a sound, a deeper shadow detached itself from the blizzard's swirling embrace, emerging from the pines like a specter. A man, broad-shouldered and gaunt, stumbled towards the cabin, his movements heavy with exhaustion. He was a stranger, yet his gaze, fixed first on the child, then on Alara, held a raw, primal anguish that was shockingly familiar. The child, seeing him, took a shaky step forward, a tiny, almost inaudible whisper escaping cracked lips. "Mama's sick, so I came here." The words, barely audible over the wind's low moan, hung in the air, a fragile thread spun from desperation. The man, upon hearing them, upon seeing the child safe but the stark, undeniable truth of the situation, the child's flight, his wife's illness, Alara's skeletal frame framed in the desolate cabin doorway, seemed to crumple from the weight of it all. His powerful frame shuddered, and he fell to his knees in the snow, a low, guttural sound torn from his throat, a sound of utter defeat and profound sorrow that echoed Alara's own buried cries. Alara stared at the man, Silas, now slumped against the snow-laden porch beam, his child clinging to his side, small hands clutching his coat. The child, a girl no older than 6, looked up at Alara with eyes that held an old wisdom, a weary resignation far beyond her years. The sight of their shared vulnerability, the unspoken despair in Silas's eyes, cut through Alara's own apathy. It was a mirror held up to her own suffering, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than cold and grief, a flicker of indignant resolve. She was too sick, too broken to help, yet the alternative was to watch them perish on her porch. Her father had always said, even the smallest ember could ignite a dead fire if given enough breath. This was a challenge, grim and unbidden, but a challenge nonetheless. "Get inside," she rasped, her voice hoarse, surprising herself with its sudden authority. The child, whose name she now knew was Lyra, helped her father struggle to his feet. Silas moved slowly, like a man emerging from a deep river, his eyes still clouded with exhaustion and a grief as profound as Alara's own. He stumbled over the threshold, leaning heavily against the doorframe, before collapsing onto the floor near the struggling hearth. Lyra, after a moment's hesitation, followed, her small shadow stretching long across the rough-hewn floorboards. Alara watched them, a strange tableau against the backdrop of her barren cabin. A man, broken, a child, fragile, and herself, barely clinging to life. It was a grim alliance forged by desperation. Silas remained largely unresponsive for the rest of the day, a heavy presence near the fire. Alara, despite her own weakness, managed to boil water, brewing a thin broth from dried herbs and the last of her preserved game. Lyra, quiet and watchful, accepted the bowl with a grateful nod, her small hands shaking as she brought it to her lips. She nursed it slowly, eyes never leaving her father. Alara forced a few spoonfuls into Silas's mouth. He swallowed mechanically, his gaze distant. There was little conversation. Words seemed inadequate, almost profane, in the face of their collective sorrow. Instead, a silent communication began, born of shared hardship. Lyra, by simple proximity, became a bridge. Her quiet trust in Alara, her small, watchful presence, seemed to chip away at Silas's profound despair. As the days crawled by, marked only by the shifting light outside the window and the dwindling food supply, Silas slowly regained some strength. He was a man of few words, his thoughts concealed behind a stoic expression, but his actions spoke volumes. He began to gather wood, his strong arms swinging the axe with a quiet efficiency that resonated through the cabin. He checked the snare lines Alara had set, returning one afternoon with a scrawny rabbit, a meager but vital offering. Alara watched him, her initial apprehension giving way to a grudging respect. He moved with a quiet dignity, a man accustomed to hard work and solitude. She noticed the way he checked on Lyra through the night, a large hand gently covering the small girl with a blanket. He never mentioned his wife again, nor did Alara ask. The silence was an understanding. They were all survivors, bound by the thin thread of a common struggle. Each breath was a defiance, each shared meal a small, quiet victory. Alara found herself surprisingly less alone, the weight of her grief not lessened, but somehow shared, made bearable by the quiet presence of these two broken souls who had stumbled into her solitary, desolate world. The cabin, once a tomb, now held the fragile pulse of 3 beating hearts. The brutal grip of winter showed no sign of relenting. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, burying the windows, plunging the interior into a perpetual twilight. Their provisions, meager to begin with, dwindled to the point of desperation. Silas, now fully recovered from his initial collapse, worked tirelessly, his every effort focused on survival. He tracked game with relentless patience, often returning empty-handed, but never stopping his efforts. He repaired the leaky roof, split mountains of wood, his quiet movements a rhythmic comfort in the oppressive silence. Alara, too, felt a resurgence of strength, a stubborn will to live that had been dormant since her family's deaths. Lyra, despite the hardship, began to show the resilience of youth, her small voice occasionally humming a tuneless melody, her quiet presence a beacon of fragile hope. But the mountains held more than just cold and hunger. One evening, a low, mournful howl echoed through the valley, closer than any they'd heard before. It was the sound of a wolf pack, desperate and hungry, drawn by the scent of the cabin's meager smoke. Silas stood by the window, his hand resting on the axe handle, his gaze hard and unwavering. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was a new threat, a primal one that stripped away any veneer of civility, demanding a fierce, animalistic response. The nights became a vigil, punctuated by the chilling chorus of the wolves. They were not alone in their struggle for survival. One bitter morning, a blood-curdling scream tore through the pre-dawn quiet. It was Lyra. Alara rushed to the window, her heart pounding. A shadow, larger than any wolf, was circling the outhouse where Lyra had ventured. It was a grisly, gaunt and enraged, its breath pluming in the icy air. Silas was already moving, grabbing his rifle, his face grim. He threw a quick glance at Alara, a silent command in his eyes. Protect the child. Alara grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth. As Silas burst out the door, firing a warning shot into the air, Elara instinctively went for the heavy wooden bar she used to brace the door at night. The bear, startled by the shot, turned its massive head towards Silas, a low growl rumbling in its chest. "Lyra!" Elara screamed, her voice raw. The child, frozen in terror, began to run back towards the cabin. The bear lunged. Silas, without hesitation, stepped between the child and the charging beast, firing a second shot that struck the bear's shoulder. The animal roared, a sound of immense pain and fury, turning its full attention to Silas. It was a battle of raw will and desperation. Elara, watching from the doorway, felt a surge of cold dread, then a fierce, protective instinct. This man, a stranger who had stumbled into her life, was risking his own for a child who was not hers, and for a chance at survival for them all. She knew what she had to do. As Silas dodged the bear's swipe, reloading his rifle with a speed born of years of practice, Elara ran to the woodpile. Her eyes scanned for the largest, heaviest log she could manage. With a guttural cry, she rolled it towards the cabin entrance, slamming it against the already wounded bear's hindquarters as it turned to charge Silas again. The bear roared in a mixture of pain and confusion, losing its balance. Silas took the opportunity, firing a precise shot into its head. The massive beast crashed to the ground, its demise echoing through the silent, snow-laden forest. Elara leaned against the cabin wall, chest heaving, the poker still clutched in her hand. Lyra, safe inside, watched her, wide-eyed. Silas approached, his face streaked with soot and sweat, a silent acknowledgement in his gaze. They had faced death, together, and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, like a shy promise whispered on the thawing wind. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the melting snow, revealing the first timid shoots of green. The air lost its sharp, biting edge, softening into a crisp coolness that carried the scent of wet earth and pine. The brutal siege of winter had broken, and with it, the suffocating grip of despair that had held Elara in its thrall for so long. The grizzly's carcass had provided much-needed sustenance, ensuring their survival through the last, lean weeks. The battle had forged an unbreakable, silent bond between Elara and Silas, a mutual respect born of shared peril and the quiet understanding that had deepened through countless wordless moments. They worked together, their movements synchronized by unspoken accord. Silas repaired the fence lines, cleared debris from the spring, his physical strength a steady, reliable force. Elara, revitalized by the improved nourishment and the sheer will to rebuild, tended to the small garden plot, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. Her hands, once delicate, were now calloused, strong, and capable. Lyra, her small frame no longer gaunt, followed them like a shadow, her laughter, once a foreign sound, now occasionally echoing through the quiet valley. She picked wildflowers for Elara, helped Silas gather berries, her presence a vibrant testament to their collective endurance. One afternoon, as Elara knelt by the creek, washing clothes, Silas approached, his shadow falling over her. He squatted beside her, picking up a smooth, gray stone, turning it over in his calloused fingers. The air was warm, the sun bright, casting long, peaceful shadows. "My place, it's gone," he said, his voice low, rough with disuse, the first time he had spoken of his past since that initial guttural cry on the porch. Fever took her, then the fire. Nothing left to go back to. He spoke not of his wife, but of his home, yet the implication of loss was clear. He glanced at Lyra, who was chasing butterflies nearby, a faint, melancholic smile touching his lips. Elara dipped her hands into the cool water, feeling the current tug at her fingers. She understood. Their losses were different in detail, but identical in their profound void. "There's room here," she said quietly, her voice surprisingly steady. She did not look at him, but she felt his gaze, heavy and considering. The offer was not made lightly. It was not a plea for companionship, nor an act of charity. It was a statement of shared purpose, a recognition of what they had built, not just within the cabin walls, but within themselves. It was an acknowledgement that two broken pieces, carefully mended, could create something stronger than either had been alone. Silas did not answer with words, but with a silent, firm nod. He placed the smooth stone on the bank beside her. It was an agreement, a quiet vow. The man who had fallen to his knees in despair now stood tall, not just with physical strength, but with a renewed sense of purpose. And Alara, who had once wished only for the cold embrace of oblivion, found herself looking out at the budding landscape, not with dread, but with a quiet, resolute hope. This land, once a place of sorrow and desolation, was now a testament to resilience, a space for rebuilding, for healing. Their journey had been one of survival, but the destination was far grander. Not just life, but the quiet, dignified act of living, together. The mountains remained, stern and watchful, but now they seemed less a threat and more a silent witness to the profound strength found in shared adversity, in the unexpected grace of human connection.